Alors, bon après-midi, Madame le Chancelier, Excellences, Monsieur Annan, Monsieur Axworthy, Madame Doucette, invités distingués, Mesdames et Messieurs. Je suis Alan Rock, recteur de l'Université d'Ottawa, et il me fait grand plaisir de vous souhaiter la bienvenue ici cet après-midi sur le campus. Nous sommes très honorés d'avoir parmi nous des personnages tout à fait remarquables, des invités qui sont tout désignés pour parler du sujet d'aujourd'hui. Je tiens à féliciter encore notre Centre d'études en politique internationale et notre École supérieure d'affaires publiques et internationales de présenter une discussion sur un thème qui est vraiment d'actualité. Le travail de Roland Paris, de Luc Juillet et de leurs équipes respectives est tout à fait exceptionnel. En organisant des événements de ce calibre, vous apportez une énorme contribution à la vie de notre université, aussi bien qu'à celle de la collectivité tout entière. I also want to underline the extraordinary contribution of David Petrasic in organizing and presenting this panel this afternoon. Thank you, David. This autumn, we celebrate the 10th anniversary of the International Commission, whose report conceived of the responsibility to protect. That event was crucial. That report was historic. R2P was a unique and creative contribution to the way that we think about state sovereignty. By the way, it's not my power that causes that to happen. People think the rector of the university can do anything with his hands. Maybe.
Do it again.
R2P was a unique and a creative contribution to the way that we think about state sovereignty, the protection of civilians, and the obligations of the international community. If you look to the origins of that report and of R2P itself, you will find that there was a handful of people who inspired its creation, who advocated its acceptance, and who secured its adoption. And of that small group of individuals who brought about this historic innovation, two of them are present on our panel this afternoon. R2P grew out of the world's horror at the dreadful series of mass atrocities that stained the conscience of humanity in the second half of the 20th century. From the killing fields of Cambodia, to the genocide in Rwanda, to the ethnic cleansing in the Balkans, time and again civilian populations were victimized within states whose regimes targeted them or stood by as others did so. When other nations spoke out against them or urged intervention, they were met by the argument that the world has no business interfering in the internal affairs of a nation state, no matter how evil or how murderous its leaders. As Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan declared in a 1999 address to the General Assembly, quote, "We must find a way to get around the impediment of sovereignty, stopping us at the borders when we arrive to save lives in the face of mass atrocities. Some way must be found," end quote. Well, Canada found a way. Our country proposed the creation of the commission that conceived of R2P. That initiative came from Lloyd Axworthy, who was then Canada's Minister of Foreign Affairs. Reasoning that a state's responsibility to protect its own citizens grows naturally from the human security agenda that he fashioned as the centerpiece of our foreign policy during his term in office, Lloyd Axworthy set the stage for the development and the adoption of R2P as a revolutionary change in the way state sovereignty is understood. When the United Nations convened a global summit in 2005 to develop more effective responses to issues facing humanity, Kofi Annan ensured that R2P was on the agenda. Time and again, he made the case for its adoption, facing down its opponents and putting the prestige of his office and his own high moral authority solidly behind the principle. In the result, R2P was adopted unanimously. Malgré les offensives d'arrière-garde envers la doctrine de la responsabilité de protéger depuis toutes ces années, et en dépit des efforts hésitants et insuffisants à mettre en œuvre ce concept dans bon nombre de conflits pendant cette période, la responsabilité de protéger a perduré. Il y a 8 mois, le Conseil de sécurité invoquait l'autorisation de mettre en place toutes les mesures nécessaires afin de protéger la population assiégée de la Libye devant les menaces évidentes et plausibles d'un régime brutal. R2P's progress and problems, its promise and its performance, and particularly its application in the case of Libya, are the subject of our panel's discussion this afternoon. We are delighted that the panel will be joined by Chris Alexander. He'll be coming along after he completes a debate which is now going on in the House of Commons. His name didn't appear in the program. It wasn't clear until last night that he was going to be able to join. Chris Alexander will add the perspective of a serving parliamentarian to this discussion, one who's been deeply involved in international issues both as an elected official and as a public servant. Chris Alexander worked for 18 years as a member of the Canadian Foreign Service. His first posting was the Canadian Embassy in Russia, and by 2003, he became Canada's first resident ambassador in Kabul, Afghanistan. Between 2005 and 2009, he served as a Deputy Special Representative of the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan. From Afghanistan, he and his family returned to Canada, where he ran successfully for Parliament as a representative of the Conservative Party this past May. He was appointed as the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Defense, Peter MacKay, shortly after the election. And our panel this afternoon will be moderated by an internationally recognized journalist whose professional skill and field experience equip her ideally to perform that role today. Lise Doucette is a presenter and correspondent for BBC World Television and BBC World Service Radio, who is often deployed to anchor special news coverage from the field. She has reported from many of the world's most difficult conflicts, including Iraq, Afghanistan, from time to time in Israel, Iran, and the Sahel. She has interviewed many of the world's leading figures, including Bashar al-Assad, Hamid Karzai, and King Abdullah of Jordan. And Kofi Annan. And next she'll say Lloyd Axworthy. She's been very busy, over lunch. Et je suis fier de vous informer que Lise Doucette est canadienne. Oui. Elle est née à Nouveau-Brunswick et elle a étudié à l'Université Queen's et à l'Université de Toronto. And after today, she'll want to come here for more graduate studies, I'm certain. So, again, thank you all for coming. This should be a fabulous discussion, and I look forward to it enormously. Merci, Lise. À vous.
Bonjour et merci. C'est un très grand honneur de quelqu'un du Nouveau-Brunswick, une acadienne mais assimilée, mais quand même, d'être ici dans le capital à Ottawa, de parler avec tous ceux qui sont rassemblés ici. Responsibility to protect. Responsabilité de protéger. Quelle idée, quel concept, quel argument moral et clair. What a great idea. What a clarion call for the world to act when governments do not protect their own people. I was in Libya at the end of August, in September, when Tripoli fell. And what did we hear on the streets of Tripoli? Huria, Huria, freedom, freedom, karama, dignity. Merci, shukran, thank you. Thank you to the world, to NATO, to the international community for helping us to change Libya, to change the region. But I was in Syria in October. What did I hear there? Where is the world? Where is the world to protect us, the activists who have decided to rise up against their government? Not everyone has. There are people who still support the government in Damascus. But the activists who are on the street, putting their lives on the street, ask about the responsibility to protect. Why did it happen in Libya and not in Syria? That is just one of the questions we have to ask today. Today, 10 years on, and I think we should all be proud to say that Canada played a role in the commission, set up the Commission for Intervention and State Sovereignty to look at this idea that when people's lives are at risk, somebody has to protect them. But there were conditions, and Lord Axworthy, I think, will remember them well. To protect wherever possible, to intervene wherever required, and to rebuild after the intervention. Was Libya made possible because of a certain confluence of circumstances, a perfect storm, as we sometimes say? UN Security Council resolution, Arab League, the call of the people, NATO involvement. Can there be another Libya? Should there be? We're very, very fortunate to have two of the people who spent a lot of time in the 90s worrying about the responsibility to protect, who in the year 2000 took the moves necessary to have this kind of a resolution. But we also want to hear from you. There are going to be cue cards which are circulating, some very energetic graduate students. I understand. Why don't you show who you are so we can know? They have some cards. You can see their hands up. We live in a democracy, and I think if anything from the events of the Arab Spring should tell us what a great thing it is to live in a democracy. So therefore, we want to hear the questions that you have as well. You can write your questions on the cards. They'll be collected, and then we'll also have a two-way conversation. You've heard a bit about us. I just want to hear a little bit about you. How many, by a show of hands, believe in the responsibility to protect? How many don't? You don't. How many don't? Okay. How many of you are proud that Canada played such an important role in its formulation? And how many here in the audience really, really wish they were Canadian? Come on, Ed. Thank you very much. Good. That sort of sets the agenda for us. But just because we support something doesn't mean we can't ask questions. It's absolutely important. It's an important part of the architecture, if you like, of the world in which we live, which includes not just the idea of a responsibility to protect, but there is an international criminal court now, and there is a new understanding in the world that we simply cannot stand idly by. The way we're going to proceed with this conversation, and because we are so fortunate to have some of the people who are so deeply involved and all of you who are so deeply concerned about it, we're going to go back to the origins of the concept. How did it actually happen? How did we get to the point where it was actually accepted? Let's look back at the last decade and see where it was invoked and where it was not. And let's ponder for a while to think about Libya, Syria, and what comes next. I'm going to start with you, Kofi Annan, as UN Secretary General. For many years, you had to tussle with a lot of big, big political and moral questions of the day. You hadn't forgotten what had happened in Rwanda, in Srebrenica in the mid-90s. These are horrible stains, I think, on the international community. Alain mentioned your speech, what was seen as a landmark speech to the General Assembly after the bombing of Kosovo, a humanitarian intervention, the alliance of the willing. What was in your mind then, if you were thinking then, of the balance between state sovereignty and some kind of responsibility to protect or at least to intervene?
Thank you, Liz. Je suis très content d'être ici aujourd'hui. J'aime le Canada, mais malheureusement, je ne viens pas à ce suivant. Mais aujourd'hui, je suis très content d'être là, parmi des amis. Et surtout, il fait beau. Qui est rare. But let me turn to your question and say that for me, the journey that led to the responsibility to protect was also a very personal one for me, in that apart from what happened in Cambodia, I was very much involved with the developments, painful developments in Somalia at the beginning of the 1990s. I went through what happened in Rwanda, and then Srebrenica, and Kosovo. These were all brutal and painful wars and periods where one felt the international community should do something. The first hurdle you have to jump over is a sovereignty issue. You have regions where the countries in the region were very hesitant to intervene in internal affairs of neighbors. So they began resisting it. You may get it into the Security Council and get a resolution. And even when you have a resolution, sometimes putting together the troops are not easy, because some governments felt that they wouldn't, either they didn't have the capacity or they were not going to give you troops to intervene in a neighboring country. I've had situations, and I can give you an example I recall in East Timor, after the referendum, when the violence exploded. I was then Secretary General, and I felt we should get in troops to help calm the situation. I needed a lead nation. I managed to convince Australia to agree to lead the operation. But each country I called, from Malaysia to Indonesia to Thailand, said we will give you troops, but only if Indonesia agrees and asks. It wasn't if UN passes a resolution, but if our neighbor asked us to come in. So I had to spend 2 weeks or so convincing the Indonesians to agree to accept the troops, and then calling these countries back and say, Indonesia will welcome you. I had a lead nation, but no followers in the end. But in the meantime, lots of people were getting killed. So as I went through this experience, and then eventually it came to a head in Kosovo, where the international community took action. But you would recall, even in Kosovo, it did not go through the council. It was action taken outside the council, because the coalition of the willing weren't sure they would get approval of the Security Council. So they avoided the council. And as I had been thinking about this for a while, and in fact, one of the first speeches I made as Secretary General in '97 was at Ditchley Foundation on intervention. The title of the speech was Intervention, just one word, because this is something I had been mulling over. So when I spoke to the General Assembly in 1999 and raised the issue of what do we do confronted with these sort of challenges, what should the international community do if they were to be confronted with another Rwanda? What were the options? And I was really challenging the community to think through these problems, because I was sure there would be other events. Kosovo wasn't going to be the last, and we will have to find a way out.
Had that intervention left you uneasy? Because people took from that as a success, but civilians died. And I know in Canada there was concern about the bombing of Kosovo.
Yeah. I think...
Politicians, yes. Chris Alexander, everyone, as you know, has joined us, Parliamentary Secretary, Member of Parliament. Just so he's also a good friend, but I'll try to be very fair and balanced, yes. Did that lead, because in Canada, I think, and Lord Axter will know about this, there was uneasiness about it.
No, Kosovo brought the issue to a head. It brought the issue to a head, and I thought I should exploit that opportunity to get the community to face the issue squarely. In fact, I recall I myself said there are times when force should be put in the service of peace, that you can't, UN is not a pacifist organization, but we use force very, very carefully, or sanction force very, very carefully. I was very pleased when I made the statement. Of course, there was a pushback. Some countries were very upset. What has got into the Secretary General for him to stand up in the General Assembly and tell us we should go this route? I recall the Bouteflika, the president of Algeria, in a discussion with me, saying you're going to give the powerful countries a license to come and intervene. And quite a lot of the developing countries were unhappy, but I tried to explain to them that it is really to protect the smaller people and the victims. If we had the institutions and the mechanisms, and we made serious attempts to protect our own people, nobody will have to invoke the term or would want to come in to intervene. And so I was very happy when Lloyd came in and said, we want to set up a commission to carry this thing forward, because we needed that sort of thinking. And when their report came out, up to that point, we all talked of humanitarian intervention. They coined the phrase responsibility to protect, which was much more digestible to the member states and to the public than the word intervention. Regardless of how you qualify it, whether it's humanitarian or not, intervention was offensive to quite a lot of people. And so they did this report. And I recall, Lloyd, if you remember, I spoke to the ambassador. We said distribute it liberally, send copies to all the member states, but don't push for the adoption yet, because it wasn't ripe. And let's discuss it further, let them think about it, and at the right moment, we will push for its adoption. The right moment didn't come till 2005, but in the end, we got it, and this is where we are today, with the Council invoking responsibility to protect as a reason for a mandate.
Let's continue the thread of history. Before, though, I pass it to Lloyd Axford, just to make it clear, at that time, were you also uneasy because you felt that it shouldn't be left to the coalition of the willing, that the United Nations, if we were talking about responsibility, the United Nations should play a more central role? Was that also in your mind?
No, it was always in my mind that when it comes to use of force, I mean, individual countries have a right to defend themselves when attacked. But when you are dealing with broader threat to security, the only institution that has the legitimacy to approve this sort of thing is the Security Council. Because if you do not accept that, you are really setting precedents that others can use. And so I usually prefer that we go through, and legally I think and even politically is wiser to go through the council. And I mean, sometimes people look at the council and look at Iraq and we forget that it was the Security Council, for example, which unanimously approved the first Iraq war for the member states to get Iraq out of Kuwait. And in a way, that was a classroom application of Security Council resolution. They did what the Council told them to do. They got Iraq out of Kuwait and never went beyond the mandate.
Okay, Lord Axworthy, you were, of course, you're so well known in Canada as a foreign minister from 1996 to 2000 in Jean Chrétien's government. Kofi Annan, did he call you up and said, Lloyd, would you like to take on this responsibility of sponsoring this commission? What went, if you remember, what went through your mind at that time? Had you also been, like him, wrestling with this post-Kosovo?
Well, it did start early, but I'd have to say that there would not be R2P if it wasn't for Kofi Annan. I mean, he provided that international leadership. It was just, if we didn't have that sort of singular voice at the UN that was really both inspiring but also reminding those of us who were working at national sort of foreign ministry levels, it simply wouldn't have come together. And I think that I will always sort of recognize that that was an extraordinary period to have been there when Kofi was the Secretary General. But if I can just bring it back a little bit, even further in history, because we're celebrating a 10-year anniversary, it actually should be more like a 15-year anniversary, because it really began with a couple of pretty pedestrian recognitions. First was when I became foreign minister, you get a letter from the Prime Minister that says, here's your job. And the first line was, you're supposed to protect Canadians abroad. That's the first line. Until you realize that there was 600,000 or 700,000 Canadians abroad at any one time. And the kind of threats that were being faced were ones that were increasingly global in their nature. Drug cartels, terrorism activities, the threat of getting involved in civil wars. There was a whole range of risks that were there. And I kept asking myself, how does I mean, how many more embassies, how many more people do you have? You have to have a collaborative, collegial, international system to make it work. No one can be an island, and that was certainly proven when we saw what happened with 2/11. The second thing that I think was an important thing is that the breakdown of the Cold War left a vacuum in the world. We had been living for 40 years with a whole set of assumptions about the way the world worked. And it was like, Galileo looking through the wrong end of the telescope. Because as soon as the Cold War ended, all those conventions just dissolved. They just made no sense anymore. And so, not just in foreign ministries, I think in journalism and the universities and the NGO world, people were saying, what do we do now? I mean, our comfortable niche, our little paradigm that we lived in, doesn't exist. There's a very different set of players. And one of those in particular was the emergence of a much stronger civil society internationally that had taken up the issue of rights-based initiatives. And the UN is often forgotten. We're very much responsible for that because there had been a whole decade of the Beijing Conference on Women's Rights and the Vienna Conference on Social Rights and Civil Rights, and that what it had created was a movement towards the idea of shifting away from a security system based on the state and much more based on individual and group rights. I mean, that's the other kind of revolution that went on. It wasn't just classic liberalism, individual human rights. It was also an emergence that minorities, groups that were in danger, indigenous groups, would also have certain rights that had to be recognized. And it was up to the state to protect those. But if the state didn't protect those, who would? And so in that vacuum, I think after probably several evenings of intense discussion and a fair number of bottles of Macallan on the 10th floor, I don't know if they serve that there anymore, but we had some serious discussions in foreign affairs and with the NGO community. But what do you do next? And we began, really what we did is we adopted the UN 1994 document on human security, which still, I think, underlays a large part of what's going on in the world. And the point about that, because I think we should never forget that, its focus was not exclusively on violence and conflict. It was also on the risk of people from hunger, from disaster, from epidemics. That the idea of human security is not just a political military issue, it's one that as many people will die from lack of water as will die in a bombing or in a civil war. The only problem is that foreign affairs, because we were also going through very severe budget sort of restrictions at the time, we just had the resources to really focus on one particular area, which was the one that was probably, as Kofi said, closest to us, because we had also lived through Rwanda. I had been in the cabinet when we had the reports coming in from Rwanda. We had felt that. We had seen the Canadian soldiers in the Balkans sort of being abused. And what we realized is that there wasn't sufficient international mandates to alter the old Article 4.2 on sovereignty to enable the UN to do anything about it. It wasn't just that there was an unwillingness, there simply wasn't a mandate. You couldn't do these things. So we adopted and used that as a basis for saying, with this, and how does this become part of a foreign policy? And I won't go into great history, but it was a much larger movement than just simply dealing with military intervention in cases where there was genocide. There was a parallel movement towards the strong establishment of an international criminal system that would have statutes that would hold people accountable. And the major part of that revolution was this, is that was saying that the risk is to people, and those who are responsible for the risk are going to be held accountable as individuals, not as prime ministers or foreign, but they have made decisions to put people at risk. And that, to me, is a fundamental transformation, which is having a much broader sweep right now. It is really evolving into, I think, what is now called humanity law.
So this is like end to impunity.
Exactly right.
Yes.
And so we were kind of part of that sweep, but what we were doing, because we were working at it from a national level.
Was there no pushback? Was there a consensus? We see in this room today that most people do agree in this concept, but in those early days, when it was new.
We were politicians. We had to sell it. We had to go out there. We had to sell it.
And all the politicians agreed?
I mean, certainly in the cabinet agreed. I think Mr. Kretchen was a very strong supporter of this. My colleagues in the Defense Department, when we took on the landmine campaign, we had a defense minister who had a lot of pressure internally about getting rid of landmines, but simply said that overall they would agree, so that there was certainly a lot of debate. I do remember giving a talk at one of the colleges at the University of Toronto, your alma mater, and one of the distinguished academics standing up and saying, well, Axworthy, he didn't give me any preface. He said, human security may work in practice, but does it really work in theory? I got to tell you, that really threw me for a loop.
But bring us up to when Kofi Annan, the Secretary General of the United Nations.
I was going to come to, so we had some test cases, and I think the involvement in the Landmine Treaty and the ICC began to establish a framework saying, hey, and people began to understand that individual government, because there was a partnership, governments, NGOs, international organizations, the Red Cross, all came together to start moving this agenda along. And then, of course, we hit Kosovo, which was the banana peel on the road, because then all the critics were saying, aha, so okay, Big Mouth, you've been saying that we got to go in and protect people. Are you really prepared to put military troops as part of a coalition that's there? Now, if I could just allow one sort of footnote, we had got elected to the Security Council on an agenda of human security. We campaigned on the idea that as members of the Security Council, we would advance the protection of civilians. And I think as the Secretary would know, we brought in, when we were chairs of the Council, several resolutions, one on women in Afghanistan, one on the idea of changing the mandate of peacekeeping, but basically to move towards the idea that we had to provide this framework of protection. And then when Kosovo hit, it was the big sort of test of that issue. And that was a matter of serious debate. I had personal serious debates. I come from a church background that doesn't lead me to automatically say, let's raise the weapons. I spent an afternoon down in the Rideau Canal with my minister of my church talking about these issues, and we got into everything from just war to responsibility, but finally decided that the equation of protection warranted that kind of intervention, and so we became involved in the Kosovo exercise. What we didn't like about it, and I say we, that was primarily in foreign affairs, was that it was kind of chaotic. It had, as Kofi said, had bypassed the Security Council. It was ad hoc. It was kind of, how did you put this all together? And that's when I think the Commission idea emerged. Can we provide an international body that would begin to pull together all the strands of thought, the history and the precedents, and that come forward with an equation that would not be some reiteration of world government, would be something, a redefinition of sovereignty as an idea, saying that sovereignty is not a defined divine right of God. Sovereignty is something that you earn by the degree to which you provide protection for people. And we brought that in as a basis of the responsibility to protect. Responsibility for the individual governments to define their sovereignty by the degree to which they protected their citizens. And if they wouldn't do it or couldn't do it, then there was an assistance for help. And if they became the predators, even more important, that they had to be sort of challenged in that basis. And on the aside, the responsibility for the international community to pick up its responsibilities to be able to respond in an effective way. The one thing that I think we should not get too centered on, maybe because Libya is so fresh in our mind, is that R2P is not exclusively military intervention. It really begins with a very strong, if you go to the Commission report, a very strong manual of a variety of diplomatic, economic initiatives, early warning, interventions by diplomats. I mean, all the tools of the trade should be used to provide a prevention against it resulting in a major threat or risk. And then, as you pointed out in your talk,
let me just, you talked about Kosovo as a banana peel.
Yeah.
You talked about the messiness of Kosovo, but all wars are very messy.
Yeah.
In all wars, some people win and some people lose. Some people die, some people live to run the new government. When you actually sat down in the Commission, you must have known that this was not a perfect world, that there would continue to be that messiness. And was there kind of pushback? Was there kind of real arguments saying, listen, should we really be going? I mean, what was, you
Well-
led us through what was really a discussion of how the moral landscape in Canada seemed to be changing and accepting this idea of human security and our moral unease about what has happened and people standing idly by. But once Kofi Annan, and you pay tribute to him to sort of bravely saying, let's look into it, let's set up this commission. Once you sat down in the commission, was it plain sailing, or what bring us into those wrestling over these moral arguments?
I mean, the commission wasn't an ivory tower. It was one that had it had people on the commission who represented a wide variety of views. You know, Ramesh Thakur from India was sort of a certain position. You had people coming from Africa and the Americas. So that it wasn't sort of a built-in fix. There was going to be a real debate. Secondly, there was
There was
a real debate, an incredible debate. There was also public discussion and consultation around the world. But we were fortunate, we got some money from 2 American foundations to help us pay for it, and I thank them for that. But it really meant that there was a pretty engagement, public engagement. And thirdly, as I pointed out, Lucy, at lunch, we'd also established a foreign ministers group that kind of did an override or an oversight saying, hey, from a practical practitioner's point of view, this ain't going to work. And as I pointed out, one of the key players in that was Amr Moussa, who later became Secretary of the Arab League. So he was already engaged in that debate fairly early on. But that, we felt, would provide enough balance, enough ability to represent different points of view and come up. And that's where I think, rather than some fairly rigid position, the R2P basically says, we're not going to disturb your sovereignty if you live up to the responsibilities of your sovereignty. And in fact, to me, I know this sounds maybe a little bit sort of heretical, but I think R2P is one of the best defenses and enhancements of sovereignty that we've had in the modern age, because you can't continue to have a world where you're failing all the time to solve with crises. But if you can actually sort of shift the onus and say to nation states, in your judicial system, your political system, you've got responsibilities, live up to them.
Well, we've lived through a very messy decade, and we'll look in detail at some of the places. And before I bring in Chris Alexander, so you talked about the arguments, and good that there was an argument, because if states are going to engage in this, they have to make sure that the argument has won. Kofi Annan, as we sit here now 10 years on, and we had a discussion about this at lunch, how do we actually describe R2P? Is it a law? Is it a consensus? Is it a norm? What is it? Is it just a tool? How do you see it now?
I would describe it as an emerging norm, a norm that allows us or helps us to protect populations, but putting the onus on the governments concerned that they have responsibility in the first place to protect their own people. But it also challenges us, those of us who are outside that country, that we can no longer use sovereignty as an excuse for doing nothing. Basically saying some crimes are so shameful and unacceptable that we cannot just stand back, and we will need to get involved. Of course, I2P has been invoked. I think we've had several examples of situations that I think fits the R2P. But as we move forward, let me say that I don't think the jury is still out. How they will describe the progress of R2P will depend very much on what happens in the next 6 months to a year or two.
So after it was Lloyd Axworthy and Alan Rock wrote an editorial saying that Libya was the real test case for R2P. The jury is still out whether that was a success or not. We're going to discuss that in a moment. I'd like to bring in Chris Alexander now, who is part of a government, who was part of the Canadian involvement in Libya, part then of the international intervention after a leader said, Zenga, Zenga, dar, dar, bet, bet, that he was going to go after his people. How do you describe responsibility to protect? And is it something that actually this government uses as a concept, as a moral argument?
Well, first I have to say, sorry for being late. One should never be late, not for one, but for two of one's former bosses. But today, Murphy's Law descended. We're trying to implement some of the recommendations of the late Chief Justice Antonio Lemare for the military justice system. And as parliamentarians here, President Former will know, when you get time in the House, you have to be there. It's my direct responsibility, so apologies. We describe, as you've heard from Prime Minister, from John Baird, from Peter MacKay, and as we will be celebrating tonight as our troops come home. I'm going down to Trenton to see some of them arriving there. We describe the mission in Libya as a tremendous success so far. But as Kofi Annan has said, the jury's still out on lots of the principles that we espouse and that we try to live up to and that we try to implement in the world, because the promise that has been created in Libya, as we know from so many of these cases, when the regime changes, the hard part begins, the hard part of institution building. You've seen it in so many countries, Lise, and we've all been involved with it in many countries. So much depends on the Libyans, the quality of their leadership, their ability to pull people together, and then to some extent it depends on us, this time in a civilian mode, helping them with elections, helping with demining and demilitarization of what has been a very militarized system. So let's be happy with the achievement so far. It went better than many people expected. And what deserves to be celebrated most, I think, what we're most proud of, and this is probably the first mission in history, I think, certainly within NATO, under a UN mandate where a Canadian was the commander from A to Z. So we take particular pride in the skill of Lieutenant General Bouchard and his team. But the legitimacy of our intervention was maintained at quite a high level. We didn't have troops on the ground. We were enabling Libyan forces to do that hard work. And most crucially, civilian casualties were avoided to a very large extent. And that hasn't been the case in other places. We've all been involved in the debate and sometimes the crisis that this creates in Afghanistan and other places. In Libya, it was really quite a significant achievement to target those who were harassing, killing civilians so precisely, and therefore to see the support for the countries that were providing those military assets remain high and even grow. But let's be clear, we were acting there not only because we've rededicated ourselves in the past decade to some principles, and I do commend my fellow panelists for having helped to facilitate that rededication, but we're acting under the UN Charter. The UN Charter is sufficient for a Libya-style mission. That was a Chapter 7 mission with a Security Council resolution behind it, successive ones. Yes, citing the protection of civilians, but citing principles, objectives, purposes that are very visible in the preamble and the principles of the UN.
Did it go beyond the resolution 1973, which talked about using all possible means to protect civilians? Did it go beyond that, do you think?
We certainly do not think so. I mean, even in CERT, in that final chapter, there were a lot of civilians who were being held back, who were in harm's way, who were being, who would have, imagine if the operation had ended then, as actually one party in our parliament had suggested it should. You could have seen a serious series of atrocities, a bloodbath in that relatively small corner of Libya, but 5-10% of the population at one point in Bani Walid and Sirte in these areas. We had to treat everyone equally, and we had, in the end, once Gaddafi and his forces had shown what they could do to their own, what they were prepared to do to their own population, we had to stand on principle until that threat was gone.
Okay, we had this neat little idea at the start that we were going to go through past, present, and future, but as a journalist, and I think we have to go with this, and I think we've now come on to Libya, and I think both Kofi Annan and Lloyd Axworthy you want to say, and Chris has gone to the heart of the matter. So with your permission, we're going to talk about Libya first, and then go back to thinking about the other examples. So Chris has made a very strong argument that all the conditions were right, sadly, to use R2P. Kofi Annan, do you think all the conditions, this is a case where responsibility to protect should have been invoked, was invoked, and was correctly done?
Chris is right that the council did give a mandate. But I think if we are analyzing it, we also need to look at actually I should be careful, we need to look at the quality of the mandate in the sense that the first resolution imposing no-fly zone was unanimous. The second resolution, many important countries abstained. All the BRICS, Russia, and others. And that sends a powerful message that you have a divided council of sorts. And therefore, when you're going to implement that resolution, you have to be very careful to stick strictly to the letter of the resolution.
And did they?
Now we have a debate as to whether that happened. I think Gaddafi, in a way, by the statements he made, did bring some of it on himself when he said, I'm showing no mercy, and starts marching to Benghazi with tanks. I think stopping the tanks from going to Benghazi was right. It was the right way to protect the people. But should one have gone beyond that and become part of a civil war is a debate we are going to have. That in effect, one became part of a civil war. Yes, people may have been protected, but at the same time, the other question you raised is that the issue of regime change came up very quickly in the game. And of course, logically, some would argue, given Gaddafi's record, if you're going to protect the people, how do you leave him there with the people? But that's also not what the council resolution says. If you say all necessary means includes removal of the leader, we should have got the council to say that. And this is where we are going to have trouble with Libya facilitate future such action, or Libya, the way it's been implemented, will see the council balking at allowing future action, particularly since so many important countries on the council didn't vote for it.
So if you'd gone to see a Ghanaian fortune teller at the time when you had first been thinking about this responsibility to protect, and she outlined a scenario like Libya, what would you have said 10 years ago? Would you have said, no, that's not what I'm intending it for?
No, I would have said, I would have still gone ahead with it, because I think the norm is the right one. We are finding our way. We will make some mistakes. We would take turns that we would normally not have liked to take, but we will be able to come out of this. I think the norm is right.
Do you think regime change is part of responsibility to protect, or it's a corollary, as Kofi Annan says, because he was the person threatening his people?
Well, it wasn't part of the Libya mission. It really wasn't.
Part of.
And we stood in the House of Commons and in front of journalists, and many other countries' leaders did too, and said why it was not. And it was decisions at every step of the way of the chain of command, of which Gaddafi was the head, that led it to come down to that final chapter. They could have called their forces back into a barracks, as called for by NATO, as authorized by the council much earlier. But I don't know what I'm doing wrong. Sorry.
I should put it up a little bit, maybe. But if they hadn't bombed the convoy at which Colonel Gaddafi was in, which led him to seek refuge in a drain pipe, history would be different in Libya.
It would be. But let's be clear. The charter under which we all operate, to which we are all committed, and in some cases renewing our commitment, the whole concept of the United Nations was born off of Newfoundland and Placentia Bay on a ship with Winston Churchill and Roosevelt bobbing around. The heads of nations that were at war. And those United Nations, the concept of those United Nations, was born of a situation where military force had to be used to protect people, but where everyone knew that the regime had to go for that protection to be afforded. That's embodied in the Charter, in Chapter 7, but also in the preamble and the principles. The United Nations is supposed to act to restore international peace and security when it's been threatened, to reestablish it when it's been broken. We didn't do that for decades, as Kofi Annan and Lloyd actually know so very well, because of the Cold War, because of an inability to obtain mandates. Now we can obtain them. We haven't always done so. We're not looking to do it often, but we have to have the credibility to do it when the circumstances require, and we also have to have the political will and the capabilities to follow up. You know, we indicted Gaddafi, and we indicted the president of Sudan through the International Criminal Court. Probably everyone in this room supports those indictments. One is gone. We would like to have seen him captured and tried, but instead he's dead. The other one is still in power.
Because of the NATO bombing that led him to be in it.
Well, don't blame the NATO bombing.
No, I'm not.
for
I'm just saying, but it
Gaddafi's
changed the
death.
course. No, I'm not
Please,
saying,
come
no,
on.
I'm not. But I'm just saying it changed the course. It changed the circumstances.
Yes.
I'm not saying that at all.
Yeah, but he is gone from office. He is no longer a threat to his people. The ICC indictment in Sudan is still unfulfilled, and we saw how long indictments in the Balkans went on because the capabilities weren't
Let's
there.
Let's bring in Lloyd. You heard Chris's
implement
arguments about in response to regime change. Does this, going forward now, after what R2P was invoked in Libya, we've seen the results, but it has made some people worried now.
And I think that's probably a good thing, because you don't develop an international precedent or protocol simply by freezing it in time. It is an evolving, dynamic, ever-moving issue. International law, go back to Hugo Grotius, starts out as a dynamic idea. So taking a snapshot of what happened with Gaddafi and Sirte on a certain day and say that's what Libya's about is wrong, because in fact, Chris does put his finger on one. It's going to be very important what happens afterwards.
Exactly.
Because part of the R2P principle is you have a responsibility to help the rebuilding. And whether it's helping the justice system or supporting a governance issue or simply making sure that everybody eats is part of the issue. And we won't know the full success till we see to what degree can you mobilize it. And that's got real odds because of the economic crisis that's taking place. The other point I would make is that you should ask the question the other way. What would have happened if you hadn't gone into Libya? How many people in the Middle East Arab world would have said, okay, there's those guys, they're quite prepared to kind of move into Kosovo and protect in the European system. Our Arab brothers and sisters are being murdered, and you're standing back. And so I think that there was an opportunity cost not to have done it. The opportunity gain is you also provide a deterrence. There's a lot of thugs sitting out there who are going to scratch their head and saying, I don't want to end up like that. I mean, even the sons are now sort of suing to go to the ICC court because they don't want to end up sort of in a gully somewhere. So all of a sudden, a deterrent factor. I mean, I don't just take R2P sort of in its purely military view. I mean, that was the instrument, that was the sharp and the spear. But the real issue is, what kind of vibes and dynamics is it setting out in terms of way in which the international system is moving towards more of a rule of law based upon protection of people and individuals and groups. I think the third point that I think is, to me, is also really important about the Libya debate is it shows that there's some things we shouldn't do again. I personally would like to see NATO out of the business. NATO is there because it's the only one that's a kind of organized military capacity. But why is NATO in North Africa? It shows that there's been a total lack of commitment over the years to enable the United Nations to have its own intelligence logistics, its early warning systems, its capacity for quick response to move in and sort of cauterize issues before they get there, an ability to provide for there used to be a military committee Kofi, that had a fairly important role. I remember that when I was back in Mr. Trudeau's government, and God, I just gave away my age.
We knew already.
Yeah, we were involved in the military committee, and they had real planning powers. They brought countries together. We had a thing back in the 90s where there was about 12 different countries in Europe, North America, who worked on combined plans. So it really is going to throw that kind of issue back. It's going to throw the issue back about the regime change, saying, at what point do you shift your mandate? And it does come back finally, and I know this is one of the great gorillas in the room. When do you begin altering the decision-making ability under the Charter? Is it always going to be a Security Council with a permanent 5 that inherited their seats from the Second World War? Or are you going to take account of the reality of a world that has a very different makeup, which would go a long way to increase the legitimacy of UN actions? Or, in many cases, I think there's movements increasingly for regional actions.
Yes.
In
Well,
the
yeah.
AU Charter,
Yeah.
R2P is embedded in the AU Charter.
Let's bring in Kofi Annan here and to clarify, because I think sometimes there's not a real understanding of what R2P means, in the sense of, should there always ideally be a Security Council resolution, and should there be, as Lloyd Axworthy said, a UN force capable of implementing it, so it doesn't have to be relying on NATO? How do you see it going forward?
No, I think in my judgment, the need to protect civilians and the decision to protect civilians may sometimes be taken at a regional level with a regional organization. The Charter itself recognizes the role of regional organizations, and in some crises, it is better for the regional organization that is closer to the problem to deal with it. Let me give you an example. In 2007-8, when the Kenyan situation exploded after elections, I was given a mandate by the African Union to go in to see what I can do. The killing was going on, displacements were taking place. In the end, about 1,200 people had been killed from different tribes, and it was tribe against tribe. 650,000 people had been displaced. But by the time I got in, there were 4 former African heads of states already on the ground trying to deal with it, plus Archbishop Tutu, who was there. A 5th president went in, Kufuor. A 6th one, Museveni, came in. And we discussed, and I said, we need one process, which I'm here to lead. And when I need help, I will call on you. So let's come to an understanding. In fact, at one point, they suggested they would deal with civil society and I deal with the politicians. I said, that's not going to work. So let's have one process and I will call on you when we, and everybody cooperated, the US, the European Union, the African Union, and we all worked together to end the killing and get the Kenyans to form a coalition government. The UN supported the effort too. In fact, Ban Ki-moon also came to Addis. Condi Rice was there. So we all worked together, but without even a thought of military intervention. The only time I invoked the military was when I was trying to get the president of Kenya to deploy the military to protect the civilians, because the police couldn't do it. And I firmly believe that protection of civilians is an important secondary mission of any army, but he wouldn't do that. So the Kenyan situation was contained. The people were protected, but not with guns. But you have the other situation in Cote d'Ivoire, where the UN had to use force to end a situation which had really destabilized Cote d'Ivoire and had killed thousands of people. So each situation is different, but the emphasis is on the protection of the individual.
But in those 2 cases, you mentioned Cote d'Ivoire and Kenya, the R2P was not invoked officially, but was it in the minds of those who intervened? Is that how it changed the thinking?
I suspect in Cote d'Ivoire, it must have been in the minds of quite a few of the people who voted for it or who pushed for it. That was a UN, who decided action should be taken. But R2P was not formally invoked, but it must have been in the minds of the people. As I said, in Kenya, it was definitely in my mind.
Yes.
Yeah.
Lord Axworthy, of course, in the past decade, we can look at conflicts, crises where it was invoked. Bernard Kouchner, the French foreign minister, said, why wasn't the world protecting the people of Burma during the cyclone when the own government was at least slow to get off the ground? It was invoked in Georgia. In Sri Lanka, people talked about it. Do you feel that there were places that actually it should have been invoked, something should have been done, but it didn't? didn't play a part?
I think the examples that you use go back to my first point, that if you go from a human security context, it's not just questions of violent conflict or repression of people in a circumstance of a civil dispute. I think that if you've got a substantial risk of people through starvation or lack of water or disease or finding in many countries taken over by drug cartels, there is a responsibility. And one of the real tests is we're going to have to work our way through that. It's not going to happen right away. And I'm a little bit of a minority in the club by saying it's time to expand our horizons and start thinking about it. It should be happening in the universities, in the think tanks, in the bowels of the foreign ministries to say, wait a minute, what does happen when you're facing a real crisis? And look, here's an example right now where you've got the circumpolar Inuit going to the Inter-American Human Rights Commission on the basis of cultural genocide and are naming certain Western countries because of their emissions policies. Now, is that a stretch? But I'll tell you, they've got a very sound legal base for saying it. Now, is it going to happen? The Inter-American Human Rights Commission will report. I'll be fascinated to see what they'll do, but it will at least add a little edge, a little perch into this debate about how you widen the orbit. And so maybe 50 years from now, you will be dealing with some of these issues. And I think in the specific ones you're talking about, with Burma, it was clear that where a regime was stopping foreign aid from reaching deprived people, then you could have looked. I would think it, if you want my personal, it should be invoked right now in Haiti.
Where?
In Haiti.
In Haiti.
It's
okay.
a mess.
Well,
nothing's
I
happening.
wanna
We've
ask
all been
you-
there,
yeah.
and that's where, to go back to Kofi's point, though, this is where the responsibility to protect is the onus must be on the international side.
Yes.
It's not a question of saying, okay, you're failing. Haiti was a failed state to begin with. It still is. But where the real responsibility lies is what are you doing to sort of provide the full scope of,
Yes.
reinvention and renewal.
I was going to just break for 1 second. Chris Alexander, just looking forward, Lord Axworthy said he thinks that Haiti could be an area. Is it now time to take a pause, or are there other places around the world that you think it worked? Perhaps we should think where Canada, working with its partners, should be doing more?
Well, there are many places. And, in Burma, we've upgraded our sanctions recently. Every country, as Lloyd says, is different. And as Kofi Annan said, is different and requires a different toolkit. But the more tools we have, the better. I think the major focus is going to continue to be on the Middle East. Let's look at the events of this year, where people have changed their own regimes without outside help in most cases, and where there are dramatic events still occurring in many countries, including in the case of Syria, where the regime is actively repressing a democratic revolt, and where the numbers now are in the thousands. We cannot take our eyes off of those balls. And sanctions, well, sanctions are being tightened. Discussion with the Arab League has become sharper, as it did before the Libyan intervention. That will be the course there. But when the whole international community stands united on a principle, with sanctions backing them, effectively implemented, in the case of Syria, it has had an impact in the past. In this case, in changing Syria's behavior in Lebanon. And now we're talking about, in a sense, bigger issues. So the unity would have to be even deeper. But I just want to take, on the Inuit, I don't know this issue closely, but I saw some radar imagery of, clouds and pollution as it moves across the Arctic. And it was very clear where it was coming from in everything I saw, and these were analysts showing it, from China. A country that...
I hope in the case of the Inuit, it's not going to have responsibility.
But a country that wouldn't have had any obligation to change its behavior under Kyoto. Okay. Now it barely has, it doesn't have much more under Copenhagen. That's still a challenge for the Inuit and for all of us. And that's another tool that needs to be refined. I just want to take Lloyd Axworthy a bit to task, though, on saying, we should find someone other than NATO to do these things. We would all like the whole world to be part of an organization that can do a mission like Libya and so forth. And in fact, in Afghanistan and in Libya, many countries from the region and beyond joined NATO. But in my professional view, I think in the view of our government, there is no other alliance that brings military forces together under credible command with the professionalism to protect civilians in an air campaign, to be there quickly, you know, as in our case, the Charlatan were, CF-18s were, and so forth, and in an organized way. NATO is still an organization that can potentially expand, and that can change and improve its relations with other regional organizations and with the UN. But when we talk about protecting civilians, when we talk about implementing the principles of the Charter, we have to talk very quickly about capabilities. And I agree there are many on the civilian side, but the military capability in the most egregious forms of repression and atrocities is essential. And countries like Canada, if they want to be principled and to have an impact, have to have those military capabilities as we are trying to have them.
Okay. I want to open I know I sort of said I would give you the floor. There's a lot of questions. Thank you very much. We have more than 30 questions, and we're going to see how many. Some of them are quite
two-part session.
Quite similar. We're going to try to respect them, but I apologize in advance. Because Kofi, I wanted to give you the floor. There's two questions which are quite similar. You talked about the world watching Syria. We've heard Anders Fogh Rasmussen say there is no way NATO is going to be involved in Syria. Kofi, if I can put the question to you, two questions similar. Could you also please comment on the lack of involvement of the international community, as well as the media, in the current situation in Yemen? And then a second question from somebody else was, if the international community does not intervene to protect Syrian civilians from being killed, doesn't that undermine the credibility of R2P?
We live in a very messy world today, and we have many such situations. And obviously from the discussions and the exchange between Chris and Lloyd, it's obvious we don't have the capacity, the military capacity to intervene everywhere. And we will constantly be accused, the international community will be accused of double standards. My answer to that is that the fact that you can't intervene everywhere should not prevent you from intervening where you should, where you could. It's a bit like saying you have two criminals and you've put one in jail. Why haven't you got the other one? Why is the other one? If you haven't got hold of them, their turn may come. But I think it's going to be very difficult for us to avoid the accusations of double standards. There's lack of capacity, and some situations honestly do not lend themselves to intervention. The governments will not get involved, and in fact, you have to make sure that if you are intervening, you are not going to make the situation worse than it actually is. And so there are lots of considerations.
Does that undermine R2P then?
Not necessarily. You are in the real world, and we also live in the real world in the sense that there are lots of people who should be in jail. Not all of them are there. Some have been dealt with, others are still at large, but it doesn't mean that because others are at large, you cannot be prosecuted. But what I would want to say here is the Middle East is going to be a real challenge for us. I mean, yes, you have, we've seen what happened in North America. We have Syria, we have Yemen, we have Bahrain, and we really don't know how all these situations are going to end. Reform is a solution, but reform is also the problem. I can imagine in most of these capitals, you have two groups of advisors. One group telling the president, hang tough. If you give an inch, you're going to end up like Mubarak or Ben Ali, or watch out what happened to Gaddafi. And there are others who are saying reform, but stay ahead of the curve, let's push. And of course, you also have the impatience of the streets. The streets are impatient. They want to see results today. And yet, reform is not an event, it's a process. How do you explain to them and get them to be patient, to give you the time for the reforms that are required? And so we don't know how it's all going to end. And we don't know who is going to emerge. And in some situation, in this situation, those who are likely to emerge are those who are best organized. The best organized would emerge. It can be the form, some form of the old regime. It could be the Islamic Brotherhood in Egypt, and NADA, just as NADA did in Tunisia. And of course, my advice is the West has to get used to the fact that Islam is part of those societies, and they will play a role. And that Islam doesn't mean terrorist. And we have to get comfortable with it and engage them. And we, you know.
Please, I just want to make one comment when it comes to Syria. I don't think we've fully played out the entire toolkit yet. And maybe I'll use the metaphor, the orchestration.
Yes.
For example, I believe that you again would have an impact if Assad and some of his cohorts were brought forward for investigation and indictment in the court. They begin to lose political credibility. And I learned one lesson dealing with Milosevic, is that once you got indicted, you became shamed, and you began to lose your political credibility with your colleagues. They don't want to be in the same Christmas card next year with you. I mean, they really want to eliminate that.
Except
And
no
so all of a
Christmas
sudden-
card, so he
Yeah.
doesn't have to worry about a Christmas card.
Yeah.
But,
But you lose your base.
Yeah.
And I think that there are still a lot of things that could be played out through the Security Council, through individual actions. I think Chris is right. The sanctions are ratcheting up. I think they can become more pointed even than they are now. You have to get a little bit more buy-in from some of the surrounding countries. Turkey is a
Turkey, for
clear,
example, seems to be
clear
taking
player
the lead.
in this.
Yeah.
But also, I want to go back to a point. I think the emergence of what I was trying to talk about this sort of law of humanity regime that is emerging as a layering into the state-centric system has to see the interdependence between the actual legal institutions and the law and the political ones, because oftentimes when the political ones fail or falter, the legal ones fill in and vice versa. And that's why you really need somebody, playing those strings a little bit, and that does come back to leadership, both in the levels, but also in the national countries who have the capacity to do it.
Okay. You have to build consensus. I'm going to put a question to you that someone said. Many African leaders have spoken out against NATO's action in Libya, including democratic leaders. You put example South Africa. What can be done to build consensus? Because, of course, these questions will be raised after Libya. What would you say, Lloyd Axworthy?
Well, I think, partly what I said before, I think we have to begin saying, let's redefine how we apply R2P so that it has a stronger regional context to it. That there are players. I was interested in a session I attended in Washington where the people in the Obama administration saying, we kind of favor this, but we don't want to do the heavy lifting. Other countries are going to have to start picking up the slack. Well, they're doing it for obvious reasons. But it gives an opportunity for a lot of others to build in. And I think that's where the coalition building can come in, where I just use Canada as an example, to work with South Africa and some of the other Commonwealth people there to say, let's work on the intelligence-based issues. Let's take some specialties where we work on these things. And that doesn't take some grand world plan. It just means some hard-nosed diplomacy, putting some resources into work, but building up a capacity, to use Chris's word, building up a capacity to be able to respond to these things earlier. And I know that it may sound like a pipe dream, but I still do believe that it's not that far out of political imagination to believe that the United Nations could not have an early response team. I'm not talking armies of 15,000, but people who can get in quick. I always use Sierra Leone as the example, where 200 British paratroopers stopped the RUF from massacring the entire country with their machetes. So there is that capacity, and I hope, and this is a hope, that the Libyan incident will force us into these discussions more actively, because I think we've been a little lazy up to now in coming to grips with them.
But it mentioned, because obviously the British went into Sierra Leone, the French played a key role in Côte d'Ivoire, the Turks are taking a lead in Syria, so it's back to what you mentioned, the Syria thing. A lot of the questions seem to have to do with Libya, which suggests that this is what is on people's mind. And I have to say, Chris, you have the privilege that you have two questions which are to you directly, and maybe that's what your politician have to be held to account. Une question d'abord en français, question pour Monsieur Alexandre. Est-ce que le gouvernement canadien conservateur soutient, souligné, soutient l'idée de la responsabilité de protéger. And there's a second question which says, question for Chris Alexander. You stated that the Libyan mission was legitimate because it was undertaken by the provisions of the UN Charter. Do you think that R2P augments the Charter of the UN or undermines it?
I'll take the second
Yeah.
question first. I think it helps to rededicate people to the Charter.
Wait, sorry.
As I said earlier, I think it helps us all rededicate ourselves to the principles of the Charter. It reminds states of their obligation to protect their populations. That is the first principle of this policy, this doctrine. But then it builds support for the idea of collective action, civilian or military, on a sliding scale according to circumstances to do something if the responsible authorities are not. So, the Charter is now decades old. We need to reinterpret it, refresh it, rededicate ourselves to it in different ways in different times. I mean, I think Canada is rededicating itself to the Charter in some ways by rebuilding our military capabilities, our expeditionary capabilities, some of which were very old and are still old until we rebuild frigates and destroyers and until we acquire some of the new aircraft we had. We could not get there very quickly in Haiti, for example, without C-17s. With the scale of personnel and equipment within you wouldn't have had Canadians there actually pulling people out of the rubble, still alive, in time to save their lives, if we hadn't had that larger, much larger, and more capable aircraft that can fly much further. Sur la deuxième question, si on est pour le principe, bien sûr, il y a tout un appareil à New York qui a rapport avec la responsabilité à protéger, qui fonctionne et où il y a des consultations. Le Canada en fait partie et on continue la tradition. Mais on veut rajouter à cet exercice d'élaboration de politique et de raffinement des doctrines des capacités nouvelles. Et on veut aussi établir la volonté politique de faire des choses importantes dans le monde lorsqu'il le faut. Just to finish, I think the Libya mission does raise expectations. Both of my colleagues have said that in their respective ways. In Africa, it will be hard to see where that goes, in part because we have other doctrines and policies, frameworks, dating from around the same time as R2P, which may need to be revisited. I mean, look at the Sierra Leone operation happened before the NEPAD. And NEPAD and the African Union have basically said, with the United Nations, these missions are for Africans. In fact, one of the crucial meetings to bring about bring policy initiatives together under the NEPAD happened in CERT in the year 2000, ironically. Where do we go with that now? What do Africans want us to do now? In light of the fact that, in spite of some very good peacekeeping missions in Africa, which we all agree it's much better to have had than not, there are some other countries and some other conflicts that leave a huge amount to be desired. I mean, Congo is all I have to say.
Yes.
I just convince you of that.
Merci. Very interesting question here. The Obama administration has recently announced plans to send 100 troops, I think they're special forces, to help Uganda demobilize the Lord's Resistance Army. I think at the time it was reported that actually to track down Joseph Kony, who has been indicted by the International Criminal Court and has been accused of raping, killing, and using child soldiers. Kofi Annan, do you believe this fits the R2P criteria, America to send in troops to Uganda?
I think this is a bilateral arrangement between the U.S. and the Ugandan government, and these are arrangements governments will always make. I don't think it has any reference to the UN or the Security Council.
But you think Washington is thinking, well, we have a responsibility to protect that great code, that norm, that emerging norm, as you said?
That would be stretching.
Well, then this follows on to the next one. It doesn't quite fit the LRA, but Is the application of the principle of the responsibility to protect ever likely to exclude the pursuit of national interest on the part of those countries providing the military force? It's back to interests versus ideals. And
Yeah, you have to change human nature to be able to say that.
So, but at least there's,
yes,
I think
let me
this-
give you one last question, Lloyd Axworthy. You have to take questions from the
Okay.
people now. They're not the voters anymore for you, but can I give you, yeah.
Oh, well, I was just going to make
Sure.
two quick comments. One, I think that what has taken place through this new sort of legal regime is that non-state actors are now accountable.
Non-state.
Non-state actors, right? As before, it
Are
used to
they?
be between states.
Congo,
They are increasingly accountable. They're
But are
brought to
they?
trial, and they can be held accountable for their atrocities. I think this, so I think that is an important change, that they're being drawn into the regime, whereas before it was always sort of purely state to state, if you go back to the other part, which I think is very important when it comes to things like the LRA and this bilateral arrangement. The Americans would have been much better if they had got some multilateral approval. See, R2P is not just you go in. There are a series of safeguards and checks that were clearly outlined in the Commission report to determine when it's legitimate. And one of them is you do not do unilateral involvements. You've got to have a mandate that's been authorized by some form of multilateral bodies, so it protects against this kind of unilateral intervention.
But let me just, since you brought up the indictment, and I know this is something I know Kofi Annan's been interested in. I think you mentioned it's a good thing that there was an indictment of Bashir in Sudan. But actually, there are African leaders, and you intervened when there was a lot of discussion at African Union meetings, criticism about the indictment of President Bashir of Sudan. And these are Africans saying that we don't believe it's the best thing. And there has been discussion, as you know, whether actually it hurt the chances for peace because it reduced your ability to get compromises, room to maneuver, because the man was indicted and you couldn't change that. And you remember Jan Eglin, when he went to see Joseph Kony said, drop the indictment at the International Criminal Court. Nothing could be, there was no negotiating. Well, some would say, well, why should you be negotiating safe passage anyway for someone like that? But sometimes people say there is a contradiction between peace and justice. So since you brought up and I really want to believe you that the indictments work, but Kofi, I mean, you intervened in this, you wrote an article about the discussion about Bashir's indictment.
Yeah, no, I believe firmly that the International Criminal Court has a role to play. And the rules are clear, where the government concerned can put the criminals, the accused, let me say the accused, on trial and shows willingness to do it. The ICC wouldn't get in. There's a complementarity there. It's where they fail or they don't have the means or they manifestly do not want to do it that the ICC sets in. And in fact, the ICC has a pre-trial chamber often to look at these cases to ensure that it's not frivolous. The people who were opposing the indictment of Bashir also said that most of the International Criminal Court cases are coming from Africa. And they are coming from Africa because we don't have the institutions to deal with these cases. And the victims deserve justice. Often they complain because a leader or a president is being indicted or being accused. I don't hear the same clamor on behalf of the victims. Who speaks for the victims? How do the victims get justice? And I also believe that you can pursue justice and peace. And the prosecutor has an incredible tool, the question of timing. You can do a lot with timing. The first thing most people will tell is to stop the killing. Take action to stop the killing and find the right time to move on the justice issue. Take a look at Latin America, Chile and Argentina. Some of the military who committed crimes 30 years ago are only today being brought to court. But the society has moved on. They've calmed the environment. The people are getting on with their lives. But they are sending the message that impunity will not be allowed to stand. And in my judgment, both are necessary. And I think we need to be clever and creative enough to move both forward, even if we have to consider the timing as optimal, look for an optimal timing.
We have time just for a few questions. I want to put this question to you, Chris, because I think it must be something that's being discussed now in the government. It says, regarding the third aspect of R2P, which Lloyd Asquith has emphasized on a few occasions, the responsibility to rebuild after intervention. What steps do you think should be taken in Libya to assist the nation in transitioning to democracy? Thank you.
Sure. Well, having a successful election, which is broadly based, where there are real alternatives, where political organizations, that demilitarization, as we know from the UN's vast experience and our own Canadian experience, is incredibly important. It's a militarized country now after months of conflict, irregular conflict. So that needs to go and be brought under legitimate authority, and police and army reconstituted. Those security sector reform lessons are very hard ones from other places.
But will does Canada have the budget, the money, the interest?
We're putting money into both of those areas at the moment, and also into some human rights issues, particularly the protection of women and the empowerment of women in Libya. But the advantage Libya has over, say, Afghanistan or many other, even of its neighboring countries, is the potential of its private sector and its private sector's partnership with the rest of the world. 6 million people producing petroleum on a level that really has an impact on international markets. That is a huge potential source of wealth and reconstruction success. And when Canada itself unfreezes over $2 billion in assets, as we did, we are sort of making an advance payment on reconstruction, on the rebuilding of infrastructure, unlike any we've ever made elsewhere, because those assets were, presumably from petroleum, were parked here by the previous regime, sequestered under sanctions, and are now available to a new government. So that's a good story. Now the monitoring, the quality, you get the bell is nodding here, will be very important, and the World Bank and all kinds of agencies, the EU, the UN, and others will be involved. So the quality of rebuilding is extremely important.
So you do see it as part and parcel of the...
But resources are available in the case of Libya immediately.
They are.
Their own, and then through the private sector. And let's be honest, that's where jobs and a place in the global equation of trade and investment will come fastest if that private sector potential is unlocked.
Chris, I would add 2 items to the agenda. Cohesion and reconciliation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, yes. Another mediation job for Kofi. We're coming to the end, but there's 3 questions here. I think they all underline a sentiment about the political nature, if you like, or the selective nature of responsibility to protect. And I'm going to read all 3 of them together because I think they underline what some see as a weakness. So this person has said, does R2P apply to all UN members? Can we expect application in China, Tibet in brackets, or Russia, Chechnya in brackets, or just small, relatively small, weak countries in brackets, Kosovo, Rwanda, Libya? 1-sentence question, is Israel exempt from R2P? And another question, after Libya, does NATO look like the armed wing of the UN? Should it be? Lloyd? You're not up for election, so.
Well, I have to face the Senate Monday morning, so. Which is even,
we have a responsibility to protect you,
which
so
is
don't
even
worry.
tougher. I'm going to apply for R2P. Okay. On the last question, I really, well, let me say overall, I think we reflect on what Kofi said. When you have a system emerging of sanctions against criminal behavior, then you're not going to catch all the criminals all the time, but if you don't catch any of them, then you really put the system into disrespect. I do think that we need to ramp up our capacity to do it, and I think that we need to change our politics of doing it, because the key issue is that right now the Security Council, as we've said, is the only Article 7 forum that we have. There are some exceptions in terms of using General Assembly resolutions that have been used very rarely from time to time. There's also the regional aspect of it. And so I think if you want to make it more universal, you're going to have to simply broaden the places and types of decisions that can be made. I don't think you can simply rely upon New York as the central focus. I think that's one of the really key issues. And therefore, I think one of the areas of, I think, diplomatic initiative is to be assisting various regions who need it to be able to incorporate R2P principles into regional agreements or treaties or whatever it may be, and also say that you'll recognize them so that we don't get into the sort of blind eye stuff that we do in a lot of areas where trade and development's concerned. I also think that the more you establish the norm that Kofi talked about, and I think Libya has strengthened that norm, I think it makes it much more difficult for other players to break that norm. Yeah. Even simple things like name and shame. A lot of leaders, there's a very interesting book by Goldhagen on genocide and what brought it about. And scholars have debated for years what are the causes, economic deprivation. It does come down to political leadership. That's the final piece of the puzzle, that if you've got political leaders who think they can get away with it, they'll do it. And if they can't get away with it, they won't. And I think that's what you've got to really work on, is putting that kind of restraint in place. So while I won't ask on specific areas, I even think that, and this really sounds obvious, that the Arab Spring and some of the reactions are beginning to get some changes in the Middle East, including on the Palestinian-Israeli issue, which has been the hard nut to crack for 50 years. I think there's a recognition that they can't take that line before, that it's only us who are going to do it. I think the international sort of standard bearing is beginning to have a real impact on what they're doing.
Kofi Annan, it's been 10 years, and as you, David and Ron, were telling you that there's been panels like this across Canada, which I think is terrific, discussing 10 years since responsibility to protect. We're very grateful to have you here. What would you like to have a last reflection on, and to take yourself back to those days when you first thought of it simply as an idea, perhaps a moral unease, and look what the past decade has brought us to?
Yeah. No, I believe we've made quite a bit of progress, but we still have a long way to go. And what is important is that we have put the human being at the center, the protection of the individual, his dignity, and the sanctity of life at the center of these, and getting leaders and the people to think in terms of how do we protect the individual. And in fact, the fact that we are all here discussing it, for me, is extremely important. We don't even have to wait for the military or for the Security Council to pass a resolution for us as individuals or as groups to take action. Sometimes it is enough, once we are conscious and aware of the problem, just to say enough, we can't take this anymore. For a third party sometimes to stand up and say that really encourages the victims sometimes to fight back. It gives them courage, and it also encourages them to know there are others with them. And so we all have a responsibility, individual and collectively, to fight against such actions. And I think if we all did our little bit, collectively, we will make a giant contribution in stopping these atrocities. Because as individuals, we move it higher up the political agenda. The politicians provide the leadership that Lloyd was talking about. So we are in this together. We can't sit back and say, let's leave it to the government, let's leave it to the UN, let's leave it to... We should speak up, and we should resist. Thank you.
There's a call to Canadians, yes. I should tell people, because of course Kofi Annan is known, of course, for his tenure in the UN, but he's a true revolutionary now too, because he's working not for the kind of revolutions you've been hearing about in the news, but the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa. So I think he would tell Canadians, don't just have that responsibility to protect, but also plant trees as well. Chris Alexander, now you're part of the emerging generation who's going to be implementing, looking at in government, because I think you hope to stay in government for a while. What are your final thoughts and on responsibility to protect? And speaking, if there was a question from the audience which asked whether your government is committed to it, I think maybe someone wants to know, is there really a commitment to it? So your last thoughts.
we are, but I think the way we put it these days is that we are recommitting ourselves to the fundamental values that brought about the existence of the United Nations, to human rights, to the Universal Declaration, to that view of the world with the human being at the center, with priority on creating opportunity. So many more people have opportunity in the world today, thanks to the efforts of generations and leaders that have gone before. But there are huge challenges at the same time. Seizing the opportunities that this year in the Middle East puts forward, taking the principle that Lloyd outlined of the accountability of non-state actors to places where they aren't yet accountable. And you and I, Lise, always talk about North Waziristan and the accountability of those who left. The difference between Libya and Afghanistan is that one regime is gone. We hope there won't be an insurgency. The other one just went to another country, and they're trying to fight their way back. Those are big, big challenges. The ICC has been active in 7 countries, all in Africa, as Kofi Annan said. What about accountability for Sri Lanka's conflict, which may have had as many victims killed as have been killed in Afghanistan and Pakistan over the last decade? These are huge challenges for our generation, for our parliament, for our institutions. And we know everyone in this room wants to make a difference on those fronts. But we want to be sure that Canada and its a growing number of friends and allies around the world have the tools to really make the difference and to match the lofty ideals with results on the ground.
I think we've had an extraordinary conversation with 3 men who've made a difference, continue to make a difference, Lloyd Axworthy, Kofi Annan, and Chris Alexander, at a time when we live in a world where nobody can say, as they did in Rwanda, they did in the Holocaust, we didn't know. We didn't know what was happening. Nobody, not a single person in this room, because we live in a country which has running water, electricity, access to the internet, access to whatever channel you want to watch. We all know what's happening in the world, and I think we've had a very enriching conversation of the origins of a very important moral and, yes, a very political concept of the responsibility to protect. And I do hope that all of you will go home thinking about where you fit in to this idea of a responsibility to protect and reflecting on what our government and what governments around the world will be doing about it. Thank you very, very much for all of your questions.
Enfin, comme chancelier de l'Université d'Ottawa, j'ai la chance, en votre nom, de dire quelques mots de remerciement à notre panel cet après-midi. On a dit qu'il y a des panels à travers le pays pour célébrer ce 10e anniversaire, mais il n'y en a pas un comme celui-là, je dois vous le dire. Vous savez que d'avoir, d'une part, les architectes, ceux qui étaient notre personne numéro 1 au monde, Kofi Annan à ce moment-là, d'aider à donner vie à cette responsabilité de protéger, d'avoir quelqu'un comme Chris Alexander qui l'a vécu dernièrement, pas seulement en Libye, mais en Afghanistan directement, et Lise, qui n'est pas seulement, vous savez, à Londres, à nous donner les nouvelles internationales, mais qui est sur le terrain, comme elle l'a dit au départ. Et je dois vous dire que je regrette tellement les quelques centaines d'autres personnes qui auraient voulu être dans cette pièce cet après-midi pour vivre cette expérience. And many of you were part of dealing with some of these conflicts. Back working in foreign affairs, in organizations who were in the diplomatic corps in a number of countries. And therefore, I think you have a very special interest because you were therefore part of it. What we have here in those people on the stage were people who were part with a lot of it. And what we normally have is several years later, somebody writing a book or an article about the kind of discussion that we've had this afternoon. We have it directly and firsthand and can take it with us. And I found it very interesting how from one intervener to the other, you were able to use the responsibility to protect, Chris, as, in a sense, giving life to the Charter. I wouldn't call it codification, but giving life to the Charter, adding to its interpretation. Lloyd, in terms of the preventive aspect of it, that it's not just when you've got a crisis that you start thinking about responsibility to protect, but way before that. And of course, Kofi and Annan, in your words, which I have written down, and I will keep looking at them every day from now on, which is really that when we're talking of responsibility to protect, we're talking about putting people at the center of what we're talking about here, and of the sanctity of life, and that one doesn't wait for decades. And we've had the Arab Spring was turning into a winter. We will have a winter which will turn into a fall. And we've had conflicts and issues 10, 15 years ago who are still there today and who haven't been dealt with. And some of these have been raised this afternoon, and Lise, you've been just outstanding in your earlier comments and in bringing this group together. But I think what we're talking about here with this wonderful panel is also saying no to impunity and not turning our back on impunity. So from all of you, I want to again express our appreciation for this outstanding group of people who have been part of history and who are helping us to relive it and to plan for our future.